Just a couple of short stories from out of the Gospel of Mark. They're early in the Gospel, things that Jesus did. Things that Jesus did that started shaking people up. I mean, Jesus became a traveling preacher and a healer, and people began to get interested in him. And early on, he began to do things different than was expected, and got into some trouble with some of the religious establishment. Here are a couple of small stories about some of the trouble he got into. One Sabbath, as Jesus was going through the grain fields, as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was the high priest, and he ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priests to eat. And he gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.'" I want to explain a little bit of the background of that story. When the Israelites escaped from Egypt, and God led them out into the desert and rescued them from Pharaoh and fed them in the wilderness with manna and opened up streams of water from rocks and gave them the law at Mount Sinai, he also gave them a lot of instructions about how to run their religion. And one of the instructions was to build a big tent to keep the Ark of the Covenant in, where the tablets of the Ten Commandments were. And one of the instructions was to build a little small table next to a little incense altar to put inside the tent, right where the entrance was to the place where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. And on that table, every Sabbath, to bake a dozen loaves of bread and put the fresh bread there on the table as a symbol that God had shared bread with his people. That when they were in the wilderness, God sent the manna so the people were able to get the manna and feed themselves and bake with it. And this was to be for all time a regular practice, showing that God shared bread with his people. And it stayed there, and at the end of the week, the high priest and the high priest family was allowed to eat the bread because new fresh bread was cooked and put out on the table. Now I know to us who have grocery stores and so on, it seems like being given 12 loaves of week-old bread doesn't seem like much, but in those days dry bread was still good bread, and that was part of the pay of the priest. And the law, the rule, the regulations where God explained how to do this were set up to say that only the high priest and his family could eat it. So when David was not yet king, and when David was being hunted by Saul, who was king, this all happened in the early days of the Israelite kingdom, David and his men were running away from Saul, and David was going into hiding. And they hadn't eaten for a couple of days, if I remember the story correctly, and they came to the tent of meeting where God was still living in a tent among the Israelites, and David asked Abiathar if there was anything to eat. David had 200 men with him, I think, and they hadn't eaten in a couple of days. And Abiathar said, "There's nothing here but the showbread." That's what it was called, the bread of show, to show that, you know, God shared his bread with us. And so David took it and ate it and gave it to his men, and they all ate it together. And no one made a big giant fuss about it. Not in the Old Testament times. David got away with it. No one punished him for it. God didn't send down lightning on him. There it was. It was just a thing that happened. So now here Jesus is with his disciples, and they're going through the fields. And it happens to be a Sabbath. Now, the Israelites were very careful about the Sabbath. God said that on the Sabbath everyone had to rest, and your servants had to rest, and your maidservants had to rest, and your children had to rest, and even your animals as much as possible had to rest. And so in order to protect themselves against accidentally doing something wrong and not doing what God said, the rabbis, the teachers of law, had made up a whole bunch of little rules to protect you from accidentally working on the Sabbath. One of the rules was that you couldn't go on a journey. Journeys were usually for work. You couldn't go more than about 1,000 steps away from your house. Another rule was that you couldn't light a fire, because lighting a fire was work. So on the day before the Sabbath, you cooked a big, luscious, warm meal to be the first meal of the Sabbath, and enough leftovers to feed you for the rest of tomorrow. They had all kinds of rules about working on the Sabbath. So the disciples and Jesus were going along the edge of a grain field, and the disciples just grabbed some ears of grain, rubbed them between their hands to get the chaff off, and ate them. A perfectly normal way to eat back in the old days. We wouldn't do it much now, but you can. If you ever grew up and been near a farm, I've done that. And not only that, but in the law, God said the edges of the field you'll allow people to glean. That is, to just pick a little bit of what's left over or what's fallen off. So that was all right. But the teachers of the law were mad at Jesus and his disciples because, hey, that's harvesting. You're reaping the wheat. You're harvesting it with your hands in order to turn it into something you can eat and then eating it. That's work. You're working on the Sabbath. And Jesus said, basically, you're being silly. He said, you're being silly. You've made the law so strong that now you're using it to hurt people. The law was given to benefit people, to work on their behalf, to make things good for them. So when you interpret the law in such a way as to hurt people, then you're misinterpreting it. And just by the way, in case you doubt me, the Sabbath was made for human beings, and I'm the Son of Man. I'm the lead human being of our time. I have authority to say things about the Sabbath, to say what it is and what it isn't, and what is and isn't permitted on it. That's what Jesus was saying. As you can imagine, the teachers of the law were not happy to be told by somebody that A, they'd interpreted the law wrong, and that B, he had authority to declare what the right interpretation of the law was, and they didn't. Again, it says, Jesus entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. And they watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so they might accuse him. We're thinking of it as like, my goodness, he's about to do a miracle. They're thinking of it like, he's a doctor. He's treating church as if it were his office. And he said, Jesus said to the man with the withered hand, come forward. And then he said to the others, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath? To save life or to kill? But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, and he was grieved at their hardness of heart. And he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. And the Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. This is the word of the Lord. The Pharisees were the people who strictly interpreted the law, who wanted to be able to read the law out of the Old Testament as applying to every part of life, as I'm sure that God does intend, that we will see and understand and recognize how the law of God does apply to everything in our lives. But here Jesus is sitting there and he's saying, wait a minute. We got a man here with a withered hand. And this is 32 AD. Okay? He can't get a desk job typing stuff into a computer. He's got a withered hand. He can't work as a carpenter. He has a hard time working even as a farmer. He can't work as a fisherman. People work with their hands in those days. Here is a man with a withered hand, and I'm going to heal him right now. Change his life. Give him his whole life back. And you're objecting? You're saying to me, wait until office hours open up Monday morning, oh you physician. You're practicing your trade. You're a healer. You're practicing your trade right in the middle of church. It's as if the doctor came in and opened an office during the middle of worship. Don't you see that what you're doing is wrong? That's how they feel about what Jesus is doing. That's what it feels like to them. And Jesus is saying, wait a minute. You guys don't give a damn about this man with a withered hand. No matter what you say you care about the law, you don't care about him. When you don't care about him, you're not keeping the law. Because the law was there to serve people. Not people were created to serve the law. The law was created to serve people, to help them be good, to guide them against being wrong, sometimes to give them orders and commands to carry out, but because that would be best for them, not because we were slaves. The whole Old Testament, which is full of really hard to swallow stuff, nonetheless has this about it, that in the Old Testament, God is taking care of his people, and the law is in order to help his people have good lives, and his people are not slaves. God's first great act in arranging a whole people for himself is to rescue them from slavery. In at least 3 of the 5 other major religions of the ancient Near East, back before the birth of Jesus, back at around 1000 BC when some of the stuff in the Bible was being written, in at least 3 of the 5 creation and whatever stories of those religions, human beings were created specifically to be slaves for the gods. So no matter what yucky stuff I find in the Old Testament sometimes, and I do find stuff that's hard to take, I find this, that the law was not put there to make us into slaves, but to free us from our own screwed upness, which sometimes does also make us into slaves. So I wanted to preach about this, and about the attitude Jesus shows about religion, and what to do with religion, and what to do with the rules, the forms, the customs, the practices of religion, and how to interpret them and understand them, even the heavy stuff, the law of God. And the point is, interpret them so as to help people. Interpret them so as to love people. Interpret them so as to do what's right and what's good for people. Simple lesson. You think it'd be obvious. I was sitting there thinking about this sermon. I thought to myself, gee whiz, I wonder, in the Old South, before the Civil Wars, in the day of slavery, did they give slaves the Sabbath off? Did they? I don't know. I went to my phone. 40 years ago, I would have gone to my desk. I would have been able to find a book that told me about it. I looked it up. Only a very few slave owners gave their slaves even 1 day a month off. A few of them gave their slaves the Sabbath off, but not a lot. And the ones who didn't give even their slaves the Sabbath off, and remember, when the law, the written words were written, it said, give even your slaves the day off. Right back in Exodus 20. Give even your slaves the day off. That's what it says about the Sabbath. The slave owners justified not keeping that part of the law because of what Jesus just said. We are the masters of the Sabbath, not the Sabbath is the master of us. So the slave owner said, hey, look, Jesus has already said, the Sabbath is for us, not we for the Sabbath. We are the lords of the Sabbath. I am the Lord of this mansion, this plantation. I have the right to say that the slaves don't get the Sabbath off. Wait a minute, hold it. The very thing that Jesus said, in order to say, stop, you're using the law to hurt people, is now being used all over again as part of a new religious custom to hurt people. Sometimes we have in the church made the mistake of thinking that once upon a time there was this old law that was stiff and rigid and didn't go to the heart, and Jesus came and gave us a new law that was a little more flexible, that did go right to the heart, but was also still a law. It was the new law rather than the old law. That's a mistaken interpretation, and when the church falls into it, usually we get over it from time to time. But sometimes we make that mistake, and the example I just gave about how slave owners used a word that Jesus originally spoke for freedom, used that very word for slavery, shows that the problem is not the law. The problem is how we're using it. Even the pronouncement that was intended to free us from the law was being used to hurt people. I remember other examples of this. I didn't want to pile up too many Bible readings on you, but I was once in a biblical interpretation class while I was still an undergraduate, and we were talking about how to interpret some hard passages that have been interpreted strictly, and we were talking about the ones about divorce. Jesus says in several places, okay, I know that God gave you permission to be divorced, but that's not the best thing, that's not the good thing, that was not what was intended from the beginning. So many Christian churches did set up a new rule, no divorces. Catholic Church still holds to it. Some of the other churches try to hold to it. Even Protestant churches that allow it used to frequently have the attitude of, well, we'll allow it, but it's not right, we don't want it, and we're going to tell you to stay married whenever we can. We had a woman in our class who had been advised twice in her life by her pastor not to leave her husband and not to divorce him, even though he was physically abusive. Even though he was physically abusive. And I remember saying, well, wait a minute, let's look. And I looked back at the passages, and in both passages, it tells the story of Jesus talking about this 4 different times in the Scriptures, but I think there's only 2 different times he talked about it, and the others are repetitions. In both passages, if you look at what's going on, how Jesus is talking, how he's applying the law, he is saying, wait a minute, you are using the permission in the law to get a divorce to abuse your women, to dump them, to throw them out, to mistreat them. You can't do that. That's not right. God says in another place, he says, don't divorce the wife of your youth who raised your children and worked his way up with you. Just because you're now 45 and you're a big doctor in a big hospital, don't divorce the wife of your youth who put you through med school and marry a model. That's a relatively common thing, and God says exactly, don't do that. He says that one in one of the Old Testament passages. But Jesus in these passages about not divorce was specifically addressing the behavior of men in throwing women out. And here we were, using a word of Jesus that was intended to defend and protect women against their husbands. We're using it magically, wonderfully, to somehow make women subject to harm and suffering from their menfolk. We haven't learned at all. We're still doing to what Jesus said what we were doing in New Testament times to the old law, turning it into a rock-bound, hard, solid rule and paying no attention to how it actually affects people. Jesus is teaching a much deeper lesson than, hey, the old law was stiff and rigid, I've got a new law that's a little more flexible. He's taking a much more important lesson than that, because even the new law can become rigid and false. And the lesson he's teaching is pay attention to the people. Is the man's hand being healed? Is the woman staying safe? Are the people being fed? In all of that sacrifice practice of the Old Testament, most of all the sacrifices were sacrifices for a communal meal. And part of the animal was burnt completely up. And that part was considered to be the part that God ate. And the rest of the animal was cooked and served to the people who were worshiping together. The whole idea was that we were eating together in a meal with God. That showbread in the presence of God, in the tent of meeting that David and his people ate, that bread was supposed to represent that God shares his food with his people. And to deny hungry people the food when they needed it, because that was the food that represents that God feeds his people? Wait a minute. Are we totally crazy? Have we turned it inside out and lost track of what it means to interpret the Scripture the way God intended from the beginning? The Sabbath was made for us, not for us to obey it, but for us to benefit from it. So Jesus says, how can it possibly be a violation of the Sabbath to take care of people on the Sabbath? The whole pattern applies to the whole issue of all our religion, which should be and often is a good, wonderful, helpful, comforting, identity-making thing, but if interpreted hard, stiff, and without attention to who people are and what they need, then it's just a thing of death. That's what Jesus is trying to teach. Not a new law instead of an old, but the right way to interpret all of the law, both new and old, with respect to how people are helped, healed, fed, and taken care of. Amen. Now, in a little while, yes, you can turn that off. In a little while,